has focused a lot on questions of democratization, how countries become democratic, particularly Western countries, but also voting systems and voting system reform. So I have one book that has looked at the Canadian context and talked about the dysfunctions of our current voting system and how just about anything else would be a dramatic improvement. And then my other book, it looks at 18 countries over 150 years, every instance of national voting system reform across Western countries. So I know a little bit about how it's done, but also about the way in which these systems work. So not just about theories or imputed processes or purposes, but rather what is the consistent kinds of results that different voting systems have produced, which to me is the most sound method of assessing their workings. But I've also studied media. And so, not surprisingly, in concert with my interest in voting system reform, I looked at how the media responded to and represented the debate over Ontario's voting system in the 2007 referendum on the voting system here in Ontario. So looking very much at the rhetorical strategies of media. First of all, of course, how balanced were media? Did they equally represent the different sides? What was the weight of influence? Who were the kinds of experts? And what were the kind of arguments that were brought to bear? And I was particularly interested in trying to distinguish between arguments that drew on facts as opposed to pieces that were merely assertions or pieces that relied on speculative concerns. Gosh, if we adopted a new system, crazy extremists would get elected. Well, that interesting idea, speculative, no evidence brought to bear, as opposed to a piece that maybe drew on, well, what has actually happened in countries that are similar to Canada that have adopted different voting systems? To what extent have these sorts of fears been realized? So, you know, an interesting kind of way of trying to assess what role the media has played. And in line with a considerable amount of media studies, I did not find the coverage to be fair and balanced. Indeed, my research showed that the media had its own political agenda on the issue. And this was reproduced most recently at the national level in our recent discussions of voting system reform. Despite my research and fairly clear expertise on the topic, I could not get an answer from any of our major media about writing an op-ed for their papers on a topic that I thought was pretty relevant. Instead, I had to go to places like iPolitics or Huffington Post. Meanwhile, the Star, the National Post, and the Globe and Mail featured op-eds by people who had no credibility on the topic. So you can imagine that was a little frustrating. That, you know, I've worked on this topic for a great deal of time, and yet, you know, no opening, and I wasn't the only one. You know, there are other people who also had considerable expertise on this topic. And what this tells us is that the media are also political players in the political dramas that are unfolding. And your ability to gain placement in media will sometimes, depending on how divisive the topic is, will depend on how closely you fall to the position of the media themselves. And again, just to use one example, the national voting system reform debate, our national media are clearly against it. So despite the fact that public opinion is quite divided, there's considerable support for change, but also support for keeping the status quo, our media were completely out of whack on that. And in fact, most of the columnists and most of the editorial pages were completely opposed to reform. And that was reflected in their choice of the op-eds and the people who got featured in their newspapers. So it seems to me that part of our challenge in trying to understand our questions today, expert knowledge in the age of declining trust in media, is that we need to understand why media have responded the way they do, and why we produce these outcomes. But let me say from the outset that I don't think this is a problem of individual journalists. You know, in my time at the University of Victoria, I spent 5 years at the University of Victoria. I kept meticulous details about the media work that I did. I did over 1,000 media interviews in that 5-year period, dealing with print journalists, TV reporters, internet sources, radio interviews. I mean, I talked to everybody, and I found, on the whole, that reporters were keenly interested in finding out whatever it was that they were examining. And I also found that if I challenged them, if I said, look, there's really no academic support for the framing that you're pushing for this story, they'd give it up. Right? That was my experience, was that, you know, presented with facts, those reporters would say, okay, we're going to have to reframe this story because, you know, you're telling me that the angle that I have taken up is not credible. But at the same time, I'd have to say that the reporters that I dealt with were generally poorly informed. Poorly informed on the topics that they were exploring, and not terribly critical of the media systems that they worked for. And here, I'm always interested in paired examples as a way of trying to test this. And one of the most interesting ones in British Columbia was the treatment of scandal and our premiers. So 2 premiers, one an NDP premier, one a Liberal premier, one a left-wing premier, one a right-wing premier, 2 cases of scandal. So in one case, we have an NDP premier accused of facilitating for a friend the achievement of a private store liquor license in return for building a deck on his house. On the other hand, we have a premier who is accused of facilitating the sale of a $1 billion asset at fire sale prices to friends of his political party. Fascinating, the treatment of these 2 different scandals. On the one hand, the NDP premier faces a group of media camped out on his doorstep for days on end until they get some kind of response to the crisis. In the case of the $1 billion asset, the story keeps slipping off the front page. You would think that this would be a pretty important story, and it is for a time, but then it just disappears. And I remember sort of pressing some of the journalists about why does this story not seem to have staying power? And essentially, when we drilled down to it, the reporters would tell me, well, my editor says this doesn't have legs, right? This story isn't going anywhere. So an interesting case of differential treatment. So our themes today are 2, experts in the media and public trust in media. And I would argue that both are not what they seem. First, on experts. Now, the use of experts in media has changed over time. If you go back to the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, you don't see media interviewing professors the way you do today. That's not what's occurring. Instead, media tend to, in those periods, do the research themselves, or go to more immediate experts that are directly involved with whatever the issue is. Media are turning to people like me as a generalist expert to fill in the gaps for the reasons that I've already set out above, that reporters, as a rule, don't have the general knowledge or the specific knowledge to make those decisions themselves. Older media developed their own expertise with beat reporters who knew their topics inside and out, often because they worked on them for years at a time. But today's reporters do not have the same depth because they're not offered the same opportunities, and so they seek a proxy with academic experts. Now, I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing. I'm perfectly happy to be interviewed and offer whatever I can share. But we need to recognize that choosing experts is not necessarily a neutral task. Some topics, engineering, there's a lot of consistency in terms of what the experts might say. There's a right and wrong way to build a bridge. And so you're not going to get too much debate from this expert or that expert about some of the details. But the minute that you go into social issues, history, political science, social sciences, suddenly now there is considerable debate on just about every aspect of things that you might want to talk about. So the point I'm making is that you can't expect experts to eliminate the politics or the political disputes from the news. Part of the rise of things like alt news has to be laid at the feet of conventional media, who have tried to eliminate debate from a host of conventional topics. And a very good one would be free trade. Right? Conventional media pretty much convinced free trade's a good thing. The analysis of media discussion of free trade shows a very unbalanced discussion. Very little space to discuss the problems and difficulties that emerge from free trade economies as opposed to more managed trade economies. And the academic work reflects that, right? There's a much greater degree of debate amongst academics about the benefits or costs of free trade than there is in the media. Well, what about trust in media? There appears to be a view that once upon a time the public trusted the media, and now they do not. But this is not true. Throughout the 20th century, mainstream media were regularly subject to complaints about bias, and the complaints typically fell across the left-right political axis. Media were held to be biased towards the center-right of the political spectrum and against the center-left. This was, not surprisingly, blamed on ownership. Right? If you're a private media, you're a profit-seeking company, then the feeling was that you couldn't expect those people to treat the two sides of the political spectrum equally. But with the rise of communication studies, many of those biases were also confirmed by scholars. right, who said that the media tend to speak with an upper class accent, tend to speak in terms of right-wing views more than left-wing views. And such media issues were also continually politicized in the 20th century. This is one reason why you saw circulation subsidies for newspapers in many Western European countries. It was precisely because the media were not seen as being fair and balanced, and there needed to be a democratic response to that. And the democratic response was to provide circulation subsidies to media sources that couldn't count on, national advertising buys from corporations. So, or in the case of public broadcasting, we saw that the development of public broadcasting, particularly in Western Europe, reflected that concern for balance on the ideological level. Right? Now, this isn't as true in North America, and North Americans aren't as aware of these sorts of things because private media was much more dominant, and that also reflected the weakness of the left in North America. And I think it also needs to be stated that alt news is not really that new. Throughout the 20th century, for instance, left political parties often had their own newspapers. Some were daily, many were weekly or monthly, and these news sources embodied their political standpoint. Now, of course, most have disappeared as we've shifted into the 21st century, but it's important to understand that this kind of news, the news, was always contested. So what has changed, if something has changed? And I think things have changed. Well, one, the nature of the complaints have changed. Today, it's the right that often complains about bias. Now, the left still complains about bias, but now the right has joined them. And of course, that seemed a bit weird before, because the complaints before was that the media embodied the right. And so they didn't need to complain because, in fact, those were platforms for their views. But now we see a number of right-wing groups emerge complaining about bias. And the other thing that's changed is the nature of mainstream news consumption. And I think it's worth exploring both of these factors in more detail if we really want to grapple with this problem. Well, right complaints about the media are partly correct. So content analysis has shown that there is a left-wing bias in media on social issues. So on social issues, we see that media disproportionately reflect tolerance of gays and lesbians, are more pro-abortion, etc. But the media is still very much biased toward the right on economic questions. So in that sense, the right-wing critique is not entirely true, because in terms of economic ideas, those are still very much front and center from a right-wing perspective. In response to such criticism, we have seen with the internet an explosion of alt-right websites, alt-right groups, and outright fake news. Now, part of this is a response to demand from the audience, right? There is a disgruntled group of angry, mostly white men, older, mad as hell, don't want to take it anymore. But it is also a response to available funding. And here I'm not just talking about the Koch brothers, who have invested millions of dollars in alternate forms of information, alternate think tanks. Our very own Fraser Institute in Canada has benefited from funding from the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are not the only wealthy groups that have been investing money in this kind of information dissemination. So it's important to recognize that part of the explosion of this alt-right fake news phenomena is being driven at the level of who can provide it. Now, at the same time, mainstream media consumption has also been declining. Why? Well, partly, changes in media strategy are responsible for this, and these originate in the 1980s with the rise of things like audience targeting, more narrowcasting. So we see media companies focusing their media content on consumers rather than readers, right? Producing content that they think will drive the interests of advertisers towards, or consumers towards the products of advertisers. We've also seen a dramatic increase in what's called advertorial content. So content that breaks that wall that's supposed to exist between editorial reporting and maybe more lifestyle features. And we've also seen the shedding of popular but unprofitable aspects of reporting. So in-depth reporting. In-depth reporting is popular. People do want to read that kind of stuff, but it's expensive to do. And so not surprisingly, that's been cut. But there's also been changes in the readers themselves. The generations who were connected to 2 world wars and a depression consumed media in response to a highly politicized experience of life. I mean, to give you one example from my own experience, my grandparents both had a grade 7 education. But they read 2 newspapers a day, they listened to radio news at breakfast and lunch, and they always watched a nightly TV newscast. They were on the left politically, but they didn't just believe what they read, heard, or saw. They consumed media in part to demonstrate that they were knowledgeable, informed, because in a Bourdieuian sense, they had a very low sense of their own capacities, their own sense of entitlement, as educated people, given their background. So they needed to prove that through their consumption of this media. But they also consumed it because they saw it as part of a larger political struggle, to keep track of how their political forces were doing in the media and what their opponents were saying about them. And it was a very performative, interactive process of news consumption. My grandfather would carry on with conversations with the television about the things that he saw. Let me conclude. We're here at this panel because we're concerned that the public may be making political decisions on the basis of fake news and false claims. And I think that we could all agree that we believe that disputes should be addressed and settled with facts, where possible and relevant. And I think here we face at least 2 challenges. One is the dramatic levels of economic inequality that are fueling the present problems for both alt media and mainstream media. The super wealthy are largely bankrolling the production of fake news, while corporations and the centralization of mainstream media ownership has led to a narrowing of the political views that are available there, as well as their coverage of the things that might be relevant to the people who need that information. Now, government could respond to this in a number of ways. It could respond by taxing those who are giving all this money, and it could respond through various regulations of the press. But the political actors themselves are influenced by the very people that they would need to act against. And so that creates a problem. Meanwhile, I would argue, if we look at the course of the 20th century and the development of modern media in that period, it was only the rise of expressly political challenges, particularly competitive left-wing and progressive parties, that forced a more balanced response from public and private media in the past. And so in the absence of that kind of challenge, I doubt that we'll see much change. Thank you.